Yeah. Okay. Hello and welcome to the third and final seminar in this Laruelle in Translation seminar series, which has been so generously sponsored by the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory and the Global Art and Ideas Nexus. We're extremely grateful to both Victor Taylor and Karl Raschke for supporting these three events. We're also very grateful for the kind support of the Basic Space Gallery and Studios where we are right now. So today I'm very happy to say I'm joined by my friend Alex Dubilet, who with his new wife Jessie Hock has translated the forthcoming General Theory of Victims, which is the text that we're going to be looking at today. This book, General Theory of Victims, belongs to the latest phase of Laruelle's thought, which he has designated as Philosophy 5, and that's a period which runs roughly from 2007-2008 to the present. And Philosophy 5 marks two significant moments in Laruelle's corpus. Firstly, we have the explicit turn towards quantum physics and quantum mechanics, although as early as Theory of Identities in Philosophy 2, we have that fusion of philosophy and science. Secondly, there is the shift in nomenclature from non-philosophy to calling it non-standard philosophy. Now, today's text revisits some of the ethical concerns of our previous two, Introduction to Non-Marxism, which comes from Philosophy 3, and Non-Philosophical Mysticism for today, which comes from Philosophy 4, but it does so taking concepts from quantum theory, many of which will come up in the discussion: superposition, non-commutativity, and so on. So this latest period begins with the as yet untranslated transitional text, Introduction aux Sciences Génériques, Introduction to Generic Sciences, from 2008, which Anthony cited from a couple of weeks ago. And it's clearly influenced by Laruelle's wife, Anne-Françoise Schmid, and her philosophy of interdisciplinarity, which is a book on epistemology and science studies, which she co-authored with Jean-Marie Leguet. So that was the first book in Philosophy 5, and then that was followed in 2010 by the massive opus Philosophy Non-Standard Philosophy, which is also untranslated. And then that was followed in 2011 by L'Anti-Badiou sur l'introduction du Maoïsme dans la philosophie, Anti-Badiou on the introduction of Maoism into philosophy, which has been translated by Robin Mackay. In the same year, also published was the concept of non-photography, which Robin Mackay translated also. And now he places that in Philosophy 2 because many of the chapters date from an earlier period, 1992. Is it 92? I think it is. But it seems to me that it's more at home in Philosophy 5 because it anticipates some of the more explicitly quantum theoretical concerns of 2012's photofiction, une esthétique non-standard, photofiction and non-standard aesthetics, which Drew Burke translated. Then we have our text, Théorie générale des victimes, General Theory of Victims, which was published in French in the same year, 2012. And the most recent book to come out in Philosophy 5 is this year's Christofiction, Les Ruines d'Athènes et de Jérusalem, which Robin Mackay is working on a translation of as Christofiction. So General Theory of Victims, as I mentioned, harkens back to the ethical concerns of Philosophy 3, Theory of Strangers, Ethics of the Stranger, Principles of Non-Philosophy, and Introduction to Non-Marxism, but in the light of quantum theory. Katerina Kolosova's feminist reading of General Theory of Victims makes this connection between Philosophy 3 and 5 explicit. In the Cut of the Real, Katerina writes that one can imagine only the radical separatedness, the inconsolable solitude of the other in the world, or for her or his or its radical insufficiency, in Laruelle's words, together with the helplessness and vulnerability intrinsic to this position. I am arguing for the possibility of establishing a relation of empathy or of the compassion Laruelle writes about in his Théorie générale des victimes, with such a transcendental rendition of the other's otherness, one based on the inceptive gesture of reaching out to the other by means of enacting solidarity with her or his or its imagined radical solitude and insurmountable singularity. Now, we talked in the previous two seminars about the imminent revolt of the subject, and Kolozova's reading of Laruelle's compassion draws out this capacity for insurrection. Compassion, which she hyphenates, is a radically passive co-suffering with victims which would bypass the non-democratic mediation and representation of victimhood by philosophers and intellectuals. In Laruelle's quantum theoretical language, establishing radical solidarity is to co-suffer the pain of the victim by unilateralizing or unifacializing, which means identifying with the pain to which the other is subjected by the world. As Joshua Ramey reminded us last time, suffering, injustice, abuse and victimization are fomented upon humanity in the name of the world. And the world and philosophy are synonymous for Laruelle. Co-experiencing the lived suffering of others involves abandoning philosophically sufficient humanism and philosophical essence in favour of what Kolozova calls a human without humanism. We might call it a non-human philo-fiction. I'm going to explain what philo-fiction is in a moment. As Kolozova explains, it is the lived of imminent revolt for the other suffering as one's own that is the basis of solidarity. Now, if we look at two quotes from General Theory of Victims side by side, we can clearly note this shift from the Ethics of Philosophy 3 to the Quantum Theory of Philosophy 5. So firstly, this is from the text which has been translated by Alex. The victim is defined by a radical passivity and not by an absolute one, which Levinas attributes to the self. By definition, radical passivity cannot react through an excess of power or by overpowering. It is impossible for it to act in a reflexive manner, but it is capable of acting quite differently by depotentializing philosophical overpowering. So that seems consonant with Philosophy 3 and its more ethical concerns. And then the second quote is more in the context of the generic and the immanental revolt of victims and of those who act in solidarity or in concert with victims. Here's the quote. The generic is a process of reduction of any philosophical or macroscopic entity of its nature of a doubling, double transcendence. Reduction to a phenomenal immanence, one, however, lived as objective, subjected to the quantum principle of superposition, is not a principle of a logical identity. I now want to take a look at General Theory of Victims alongside some of the other texts in Philosophy 5, especially Anti-Badiou, to which I think it is closest, and Photofiction. In these two books and in Christofiction, Laruelle outlines and sketches a generic science or a human genre of the ordinary man, which has as its goal, as always, the delivering of thought from its ontological primacy. This science of the ordinary man could also go under the names of the stranger or the victim, which has been unthought by or foreclosed to philosophy, is brought about through the conceptual deployment of what he calls or axioms, or more simply, the lived decisions of the generic subject operating the science of philosophy. So non-philosophy invalidates or shears away the auto-epistemological hierarchy of being via a quantum superposition. What I think Laruelle means to do in making such a move is to replace the ontological with the prior to priority, without hierarchy. As he writes in General Theory of Victims, the victim is radically pre-predicative, or more precisely prior to the first, and the generic subject is underdetermined so that we may escape from the philosophical presupposition of the victim as already given. This is an essential principle of non-standard philosophy, that radical immanence acts as unilaterality or as last instance, non-commutable with any form of philosophical transcendence. And Laruelle accords to immanence a quasi-subjective but generic function as non-egological in the last instance. In radically fusing science and philosophy, non-standard thought underdetermines both science and philosophy, giving us a non-philosophy that is equally a non-science. Philosophy and science are unilateralized, or in earlier books he would have said dualized, via their underdetermination, a sacrificing of their englobing sufficiency to a quantum-type superposition. In separating philosophy from its double, the world, we get the vision in one. The ethical commitments of this quantum superposition and underdetermination are foregrounded in Anti-Badiou, where Laruelle says, philosophy's liberation from itself is the occasional condition for the liberation of humans, but the liberation of humans is the underdetermining condition of philosophy. But this is also discernible in general theory of victims, when Laruelle cautions that the victim is not an exemplary man or the correlate subject of an extraordinary event, and speaks of the messianity of the victim. The victim returns as Christ, and this return is figured as a coming under. Non-philosophy itself might be understood as a messianicity. I'm saying messianicity rather than messianity, insofar as it is futural, an ongoing process in the form of a series of oceanic swells, undulatory, a swarming of conceptual particles, or a new wave. These oceanic undulations are all in the service of a radicalization of the desperate situation of man in the world. Non-philosophy as messianicity, as weak thought, involves the invention of an apparatus of generic thought that is non-scientific and non-philosophical, making use of philosophy and science as materials, but quantum means quantum without finality. Non-philosophy might also be put in the place of victim, given its own solitude and its hesitations, the institutional and editorial censure it has suffered since its birth and still suffers today. This suffering puts non-philosophy in the best position to mount a defence in every case of humans and not of philosophy, of humans taken in body in their generic materiality, a universal defence of humans qua generic subjects, a principle of minimising the inevitable harm done to philosophy and to the modes of thought that are subordinate to it. As Anthony Paul Smith told us, non-philosophy borrows its idea from the Marxist practice of the transformation of the situation of humans in the world. Laruelle writes himself in Anti-Badiou that the man subject of philosophy is reversed into the generic subject man. This is the displacement into prior to priority of man as generic, implying imminently the displacement of the transcendent ego, which is no longer at the heart of the lived, but on its margins. The generic subject or science subject is unilateralized, particulate and unifacialized. In Laruelle's quantum theory of the lived, which is of the order of the means of man as last instance, he is humanized but desubjectivized, in the sense that he loses his principal predicates of consciousness and reflection. This is what general theory of victims means by prior to first passivity. There, Laruelle says that the prior to the first condition in its non-acting is not an insufficiency, an involuntary or accepted weakness. Weak force is not a lesser force against the force of force. On the contrary, weak force is a democratic force of thought against philosophy's narcissistic omni-validations. He says there is no vicious circle as there is in philosophy, but a single superposed power of being victim and resistant, divided up on occasion. Non-philosophy is then a scenario of the future, or what Laruelle calls futurality, as that which comes under. Now this is where we see a shift from all philosophy, or the principle of sufficient philosophy, to the imminent messianicity of philo-fiction, as no longer determining, but rather as philosophy's radical coming under. Laruelle asserts that being foreclosed or non-acting is deployed as acting by the clone or resistance. In this resistant, man in person comes under as messianity. Non-acting is the radically passive under-potentializing or under-determining of transcendence. In the wave-particle thought of Laruelle's generic science, the particle manifests the suspended world or the halting of sufficiency. He says that philosophy presents itself as principle of sufficient justice, as if it sufficed to philosophize the victim in order to do it justice. But immanent non-acting underdetermines the weak act, or the least act, of transforming the philo-world into philo-fiction, philo-fiction being for the world, which is the only possibility left to man. Non-acting is a vector or resistance, or a vector of resistance, and as Laruelle argues in Anti-Badiou, the only weapon of the poor would be stranger subjects, the lived without life, Christ subjects, the only weapon of those stripped not only of all but once and for all of the all itself is invention. It will be a matter of passing from absolute poverty to radical poverty as non-philosophical loss of philosophy. In photofiction, Laruelle also makes a case for generic insurrection, indetermination or underdetermination, and this time it is the non-philosophical halting of the principle of sufficient photography. Again we have the victim as Christ returned, coming under. The photograph, he says, is the art of revival, of resurrection, but it is a weak art, as photofiction depotentializes logophotocentrism. The concept of non-photography is less determinant than underdeterminant. It is a weakened or weakening causality that removes determination from the resulting image. The crucial ethics which follows from the development of photofiction, it's a really bad pun, the development of photofiction, is an ethical safeguarding of humans within photofiction. Later on, Laruelle writes that the generic photo is ethically people-oriented in service of their defense and passes from the positive photo devoted to narcissism of the world to the generic photo, which is not that of subjects but rather objects. Here the quantic model works via a futural retroactivity, which Joshua talked about last time, and this model comes to shatter the macroscopic schema of the doublet and introduces another schema that is messianic and Christic in quartializing according to the negative quarter turn, the circle of time or eternity. A quasi-Judaic dimension is reintroduced in a weak and non-authoritarian mode without giving rise once again to the eternal return of the same. It is futurality in its messianic dimension. Similarly, in Christofiction, we witness a quantic-oriented non-philosophical exit from the principle of sufficient theology. Philofiction, photofiction, and Christofiction are resistant non-actings or underpotentializations, imminent clonings or fictions, which do not produce or reproduce philosophy's auto-confirming truths. The radical stranger or the victim revived as underdetermining works at transforming the definitions of himself that he has received from the dominant intellectual and the victimizing philosopher. If a subject can co-suffer in imminent revolt with other strangers, then he, she, or it will have to be the poor generic subject, the human in the last instance, and not the all-sufficient or all-too-rich philosopher. So today we have Alex Dubilet, who's recently finished a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, under the direction of Judith Butler, no less. And he works on Hegel, Laruelle, and Meister Eckhart, among many other things. And I'm very pleased to have one of the translators of General Theory of Victims with us here in Dublin today. So, over to Alex.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, all our sponsors. And thank you, Jessie, who's not here today, but without whom none of this would be possible, because in some ways she is at least half, or she's at least half, but most likely 75% of this translation. And also thank you to Anthony, who was the one who kind of proposed this translation in the first place. So thanks for everyone who made it possible. So perhaps the most natural place to start discussing Théorie générale des victimes is to think through the figure of the victim that gives the book its name and provides the overall theoretical banner under which it is written. A sense of Laruelle's undertaking is made audible at once by the book's epigraph, which reads, "If the executioner is the cornerstone of society, Joseph de Maistre, why would the victim not be the cornerstone of humanity?" Here one sees the split between the social and also, one should say, the worldly, which centers on a certain kind of circular and endless violence, the figure of the executioner being kind of prime a locus for that, and on the other hand, the attempt to think humanity outside of that logic by rethinking the status of the victim. And yet Laruelle is not attempting to add to the victimarian or victimological thought that he diagnoses as being dominant in contemporary media discourses, but to think the victim anew using tools of non-standard and quantum discourses. At a fundamental level, the concern with the victim continues Laruelle's general theoretical trajectory of critically diagnosing and attempting to dismantle, or as he frequently says, debasing the philosophical apparatus of transcendence that underwrites the world and leads to processes of continual victimization. This is to say, general theory is not a practical manual, but a theoretical reconsideration of how we think of the victim in the first place. But this is not to say that there are no practical ramifications. After all, one could say in a slightly Deleuzian way that concepts and life are intimately interrelated. The way one articulates life in thought renders possible or impossible certain modes of inhabitation and cohabitation. But it is to say that the concern is still very much with dismantling the logics underwriting the theoretical articulations, both philosophical, mediatic, theological, and others, And for Laruelle, the mediatic and media discourse are basically, and media intellectuals, as he calls them, are all bad, kind of poor versions of philosophy, but they're still fundamentally philosophical in orientation. So it's the central concern is very much dismantling these logics which all produce continual victimization for him and repeatedly produce new victims as a result. The problem of philosophy's dealing with the victim is both historical and theoretical. Historically, the problem is simply that philosophy never gave any attempt to actually think the victim as anything but an effect, a secondary exception, a failure of the proper philosophical order. As Laruelle recounts the genealogy, quote, "For philosophy, the victim is a secondary object to which it retains but a few allusions. Ancient philosophy was only aware of the victim, in the anonymous form of the victim of destiny, maliciousness, and vengeance. The classical period, more interested in war, made the victim into inevitable collateral damage, bringing forth the lamentation of poets and a first intellectual defense," which for him is Voltaire, but not as a kind of symptomatic name. The philosophy of the 20th century, following the two world wars and the programmatic and systematic ideological and ethnic exterminations that accompanied them, extended the victim's concept and its causes, and dramatized it, but always laterally, marginally, and as an exception to the proper philosophical order. The victim had to pass a quantitative threshold, that of a great number, and persecution an ethnic or technological threshold, for it finally to become interesting and visible, for its concept to be spread juridically and through the media. So the trajectory which Laruelle narrates actually several slightly different ways throughout the book, shows how the victim was never properly thought as primary, but always as a kind of casualty, an accident, a horror, a secondary product to the proper philosophical order or to the order of nature, or is simply covered over, explained and explained away by theological paradigms of original sin or evil, but never taken seriously in itself. And this stress on the theological paradigm of evil and original sin as explaining away the possibility of victims is something that he gives in an alternate genealogy that occurs in the book. But it very much you could see the way something like original sin winds up blaming certain forms of victimhood on the victims themselves, right? So at the same time, he's also very aware that in there is a recent reversal and a certain proliferation of the victim's discourse about the victim, of the victim, centered on the victim. And he's very well aware of that. But what he's trying to do is, I think, articulate a non-standard theory of the victim that is located between or outside of these 2 points of one, the kind of mediatic overexposure of the victimarian discourse, and another kind of complete philosophical neglect, or kind of because both of those poles are in some ways a failure to think the victim properly. So, in contrast to Badiou, who rejects the discourse of the victim and calls for a strong thought, a militant thought, Laruelle seeks to think the victim as what could be called one of the first names for the man and person, or even, as he calls it, its ethical modality. In this, Badiou, in the way Badiou rejects the discourse and calls for kind of a strong militant thought, Badiou is convergent with Heidegger, and both stand for high philosophy in Laruelle, because both, quote, admire only the founding heroes and legislators of cities or of worlds, and have nothing but scorn, denial, or best indifference for democracy and victims. This comment pivots between philosophy's historical erasure of the victim, which is to say never properly thinking or conceptualizing it, and its theoretical complicity in the process of victimization, by theoretically underwriting or legitimating that victimization in thought itself. Recapitulating the line of thinking already present in previous work, Laruelle diagnoses philosophy's complicity in constructing the world, which always remains the world of victors, of objectivity, or at most the discourse of survivors, but not of victims themselves. Philosophy has always given credence, but also embodied, quote, a masked theodicy. This is why, in rather grandiose language, perhaps, the task of the text becomes to enter the depths of the philosophical cave, the Platonic cave, containing the mass graves of victims. So there's a way where philosophy is, for Laruelle, is complicit in underwriting a kind of endless production of victims. The world becomes a kind of burial ground, and philosophy is essentially complicit in both its creation and its subsequent disavowal. The victim, however, is not a sociological or even empirical object for Laruelle, something that would be easily identifiable. As the text warns at the outset, it is impossible for such a theory to speak of victims in themselves, the way common sense, the media, and thus philosophy speak of them, assuming that this object, its production, its affects, and its task are all well known. Victims are neither identifiable subjects nor solid objects enclosed in a world and then in turn assailed by that world. Indeed, to understand Laruelle's theory of the victim, one needs to introduce at least two other concepts almost at the outset, namely man and person and the lived. This is because the victims are not simply individuals, but, as Laruelle writes, those neutralized or without life, lived or lived experiences, translation of vécu in French, or their Erlebnis, so let me start again. Those neutralized or without life, lived experience, their Erlebnisse, rather than the categories of individuals, even if these lived experiences are localizable according to those individuals. Then the quote continues, the non-individual lived experience of being exploited, of being excluded, those of being murdered, of the being persecuted, of being humiliated, and not, as history and philosophy, united in their shared empiricism due to quickly exploited, excluded, murdered, persecuted individuals. And this is because those individuals are only the occasional bearers of non-individual lived experience and who belong complementarily to the second causality. So this thought of the lived is what Laruelle calls a formalism, but it is a lived material formalism, which is meant to be a thought that abandons the primacy of corpuscular bodies, individualized and subjectivized, or subjectivated. It presents a way of rearticulating materiality that does not prioritize subjects, bodies, or individuals. But these vécus, these lived, are not simply transcendental conditions, but are precisely material lived experiences that lack subjects. That in the last instance are without subjects, but which subjects kind of take on and become occasions for. I think the status of the lived is actually quite a difficult one in Laruelle's thought, and something that we might want to discuss. But it is a way, I think, of thinking materiality without rendering it simply objective or simply subjective. On some level, this is clearly a reworking of Heidegger's existential analytics and phenomenology. It's clear in the French because, for example, it's être persécuté, which is the same way that various kind of Heideggerian terms in French get translated. So, like thrown is être jeté in French, right? So there's a way where this is clearly on a basic linguistic level a rewriting of Heidegger. But there's no longer a subject to attribute them, or even a Dasein to which they could be ascribed to. And I'll return to this point slightly later. I also find Anthony's suggestion in his book really useful in this. He connects Laruelle's lived with Deleuze's articulation of the immanence of the depersonalized common life, the une vie that comes in his last essay, Immanence of Life, where it's not a life of a subject, but a common generic life that occurs at the moment of kind of desubjectivation. And kind of as a side note, I would say a kind of tentative suggestion. I think Laruelle's concern with the lived of the victim can be quite productively tied to the questions of precarity that have come into theoretical prominence recently in other discourses, right? For precarity is precisely not a subjective position, but can be read as a lived possibility of all subjects that precede their subject formation, right? In both cases, we're discussing a certain capacity of being affected, a vulnerability which becomes a certain condition of possibility of any actual act of victimization. That is, precarity, vulnerability precedes and exceeds any moment of kind of full kind of victimization or kind of attack or something like that. And this is a tentative remark, but one of the reasons why I make it is that I think that those kind of connections are productive insofar as they might make Laruelle's thought slightly less hermetic and enclosed in kind of in its own kind of program, which oftentimes seems unconnected to other programs. But I do think on this point, for example, there could be a productive thought with questions of precarity. And he does use the term, but it's I think once or twice in the book, but it's clearly not, at least here, something very important for him. So, on one side, the victim is connected with the lived. On the other, it is with man and person, or with the generic human, which for Laruelle is not part of the world, nor is it constructed metaphysically, but is a kind of vanishing, apophatic, undeterminable point which is not exhaustible by the world. As he says, the in-person is something without metaphysical identity, in contrast, say, to the subject of the world or the rational animal, which are kind of distinctly metaphysical definitions. Here one sees, I would say that here one sees the limits of the kind of comparison with Heidegger, because instead of in the world, or for Laruelle, there's a distinct difference between kind of the subject in the world and the kind of generic man and person, which has a different, there are kind of two different forms of causality, right? So the liveds are related to the in-person rather than the kind of in the world, which is philosophically determined. And also he at some point says that the world transgresses onto man rather than a traditional phenomenological kind of intentionality where man transcends into the world, right? And so there's a kind of a reversal there as well. So some forms of this kind of definition of man and person is repeated again and again in different ways and in slightly different lexicons. For example, being victim is of no use for measuring or classifying humans. It renders them non-separable without dividing them in order to reach them again. And this is what he thinks philosophy does. As man and person, the victim is an absent or vanished referent. It is unrepresentable and only representable, but this is always already too late, precisely when it is in the grip of a process of victimization. So it's in the process of victimization that you could identify it as a victim, but in itself, the man and person for him is absent from the world and cannot be identified, right? Cannot be grasped by the world. The victim becomes a kind of generic experience or state of the human, and thus universal, but so without definitions, for close to philosophy and the reasons of intellectuals. Now, general theory overall constructs an ethics in several interrelated modalities, and I think can be read precisely as articulating kind of an ethical modality of Laruelle's thought, as Michael already mentioned. The central element of this ethics is a movement, quote, from philosophy and its morals to a formal and more elevated plane, an ethical plane centered on relations, this time between man as generic being and all of philosophy as purveyor of morals. So again, you see a kind of inversal. Key here is the insistence that man, understood as man and person, is not determined by the world but precedes and exceeds it and remaining irreducible to it. This is the question of unilaterally subtracting man and person from the world, which always seeks to enclose it. Man and person, this is a quote, is the condition under which philosophy and ethics are placed. The first move is then to insist that man is not enclosed in the world, but rather is foreclosed to it, which undoes the central failure of philosophy, which precisely enforces such a reduction. The man is always a man in the world, or the human is always the generic human that's determined by the determinations of the world and philosophy. Philosophy kind of inscribes man into the principle of its own sufficiency, inscribing it into its own definitions, its own metaphysical definitions or moral definitions. This link is what Laruelle repeatedly in almost all his works tries to break. The second move is to transform the relationality. So it's not a simple reversal, now man or the human or the man and person towering over philosophy and the world, but rather relationality that debases or kind of pulls down any transcendence, any kind of hallucinatory solidity of the world towards the immanence of the lived. So instead of following a moral philosophy, which is to say a transcendental prescription for human life, what is good, what is bad, for example, what Laruelle seeks is to articulate an ethics in which history, tradition, the very thing the world kind of generates and the continuities that it fosters become merely materials for the use of humans as victims. And it is an inversal that collapses the entire field in some ways. He says the task is to remove ethics from philosophy, which is nothing but one of its materials, and place ethics under the condition of the victim and person. Or again, he says, and I think these quotes they're getting at the same point in different ways, and I think in some ways hearing a number of different quotes, some have kind of become more understandable than others. But he says, in his critique of morality, he says, even the hierarchy of good and evil, will have been only a means to oppress and threaten human life. So for him, it's this kind of the way moral philosophy or morals in philosophy function is ultimately as modes of oppression, and what he wants to do is inverse it in such a way that they all become mere materials in relation to the kind of the generic human. And I think one of the things, and I think Anthony is really good on this point, is to really break with kind of theodicy or self-justification of the order of the world or the powers that be or the event, but really all these kind of philosophical conceptions or theological conceptions make them serve the kind of the generic capacity of the human and of the victims of those kind of transcendent and transcendental frameworks. So I would suggest that general theory of victims articulates an ethical thought insofar as it seeks to invert, but without creating a new hierarchy, the relation of man to world, and at the same time produce an ethics for the intellectual, that is, to reconfigure the relationship of the intellectual in relation to man and the victim. I think your quote from Katrina's book on compassion was precisely a discussion of this, a kind of, instead of an identification, instead of representing the victim and therefore having a kind of hierarchical relation, the question is of inhabiting that state in a kind of a full identity with it. A generic or non-standard thought becomes a thought from the victims, cloning the victim's status, inhabiting that very identity, and one that seeks at all costs to avoid legitimating their persecution, or representing them, or merely representing them, while remaining external to them, right? Because representation is always a kind of externality, and in some ways, his problem with representation, I think, is his general problem with mixtures, right? There's a kind of mediational apparatus that kind of in some ways disavows and re-victimizes that which it's trying to alleviate. Right? So it is imperative that the intellectual take on, or that he assume the victim as his immanent condition, the site and body of practice in which he dangerously tests out his own subjectivity. Or again, Laruelle writes, thus a different idea of the generic intellectual and his tasks, which are no longer classically heroic, virtue, happiness, courage, or even heroic or political, taking sides against the powers that be, defense of democracy, but in prior priority, the defense of the victim. And so there's, again, these are, I think that some of these quotes, they're saying precisely or similar things, but in different ways. And in his opposition to, say, the classically heroic or heroic political virtues, it's again, you could see his contrast to someone like Badiou and Heidegger, where he says the classical philosophy embodied, or modern philosophy embodied by those two names, there's always a valorization of the hero and the kind of creation of new cities, new worlds. But he says, look, he says the victim opens no new worlds but closes old ones, because in some ways it shows the insufficiency of the world and its self-justification. In some ways, the victim is the radical disclosure of the insufficiency of the world, of any plan of salvation, of any and all guarantees. So in critiquing philosophy towards ethics, Laruelle follows Levinas, but he does so without following Levinas into the conception of man as hostage of the other. Instead, the discursive frame in the text is always set up as a kind of third between Greek metaphysics, a name for philosophy which affirms the world in its totality and transcendence, and Judaic metaphysics, on the other hand, which stands very much for Levinas, right, which affirms the infinite transcendence of God. So on one side we have the kind of transcendence of the cosmos standing with philosophy. On the other hand, we have the kind of infinite transcendence of God that stands on the side of Levinas. The third is the generic position that affirms man as a kind of indeterminate one, or the in-person. And as Laruelle explains it, we call it generic in order to suggest that it is restricted to mankind alone, as well as to suggest its simplified, reduced, and neutralized sub-philosophical constitution. And this theory of mankind is at once universal or transcendental, and one not yet or not fundamentally divided up into particularity. And he says it's the man and person is something that, because it's apophatic or because it's kind of lacks metaphysical identity, it's not graspable by the world. It's, in fact, he wants to think of it as not yet divided into races, ethnicities, nationalities, and so on. which is why he thinks of it as kind of universal thought. But yet this unity for him cannot be simply a unity, a transcendent unity through essence or nature, right? It has to be a kind of almost like a negative unity. In other words, he's critiquing ontology without moving towards an ethics based on transcendence and ultimately on the transcendence of God, but instead is defining the generic as that which is fundamentally without salvation and which can be mutated from whatever plane, either philosophical or theological. And I think another way to think of the Laruelle-Levinas kind of like relationship, at least as it's figured in this text, is that I think he doesn't think that the self-other split is a fundamentally kind of central split, right? He will say something like, as man and person, I am also the fragile other or the subject stranger, right? So the other, and in some ways, and otherwise than being the other is already inside me, but I think that he's constantly playing and trying to invert the kind of insistence on transcendence toward a kind of an immanent genericity. So I think it's important to linger on the status of man or even man and person in Laruelle's work and like what this name does, because I generally agree with those who want to question its use as a name or term in his work because of its clear anthropocentric problems, its gender problems, although Katrina clearly does very productive work, but still, why man? Of course, I'm not alone in this. I think in various forms, Anthony and Joshua and many others have posed the same question. So in Théorie Générale, as another text, Laruelle is at pains to differentiate his use of man from the traditional humanisms. Indeed, he goes so far as to say humans are defined as man and person or without humanism. And again, a thought that retains man, but as having lost all of his attributes. In Laruelle's thought, this figure is what allows the breaking down of the sufficiency of philosophy, its production of the world, and the inversion. Also, it allows the inversions of all the dualities and mixtures, kind of unilateralizing them in favor of the primacy of the real. And yet, I think there's a tension between this underdetermined and undefinable nature of the real and naming it man and person or even just man, which he does throughout the book. So, for example, he says he doesn't exist anymore in the sense that one could attribute to him visible and itemized properties. His representation having been destroyed, but he insists, man and person insists by his effects like a black box that only signals by its inputs and outputs. It is neither an object nor even anonymous for itself, but a generic identity separated unilaterally, without relation, including a relation that participates complementarily in it without damaging it. And yet the question is, if it is a black box, why is that black box not simply the real, but also accrues the name man? Is man, however empty, however stripped, remain a privileged name of the generic? If so, by what characteristic can that be maintained if we have stripped it of all of its characteristics? Is the apophatic indexical that somehow knows that it's man still remaining? And if not, if it's truly has lost its priority, if it has truly lost its priority, as Laruelle insists on in things like man without humanism, which being unidentifiable, lacking all hierarchy, why does it retain still that name man, or how does it? And I would say that at the same time, I would say it's a kind of like those questions are real questions, because on the other hand, you can't just. I think Joshua, for example, proposed think of it in a kind of trans-animist form. I think there's moments in this text that clearly want to prioritize the human as the generic species, and it is. I was going to get to this later, but Anthony, I think, talks about how the generic, or he might have mentioned this if I remember correctly, that the Marx's Gattungswesen and is actually in French translated as l'être générique, and like the generic is very much a question of like the human in Laruelle, right? So it's not like maybe man could be kind of moved to the human, but you're not getting out of that anthropocentrism unless you really start undoing kind of some fundamental things that he's doing in this work. Like if you take non-standard thought against the kind of the humanism here, or without the man without humanism, but still the kind of if you want to untangle the name man from the real, it seems to me that there's kind of a lot of theoretical work would have to be done kind of based on non-standard thought. after all, Laruelle notes, for example, several instances in which I think like you can't get out of the fact that this is a human characteristic, right? For obviously the state of victim extends far beyond humans, which seems good, right? The victims are not just human, but he finishes the sentence, but it is only because there are humans that there are, in the last instance, other victims who must share the fate of the generic species. And again, this redoubling, man and person is not exactly ambiguous. It is a unilateral complementarity. It is at once a generic human and a simple animal. So you see there in some ways, or at least it seems to me that at least prima facie, there is a kind of distinction between the genericity of the human, which is undetermined in the world, and some kind of its own animality, which is somehow maybe implicated in the world, maybe not, maybe implicated in some kind of biological life. I'm not sure. I'm actually, this is just a kind of a genuine question. I don't really have ways to resolve this, but I think one of the reasons clearly that it's useful is that man becomes a name that allows a certain kind of democratic and imminent use of certain materials in which man has been used, right? So, which is to say, it allows a certain kind of reconfiguration of the history of metaphysics. So he doesn't forget the fact that man was a figure that did all sorts of or functioned conceptually as producing all sorts of victims, exclusions, and so on, and that it's trying to kind of rework in a way that no longer does it, right? In a similar way, I think that the way that Anthony discusses the name nature as a first name of the real, and the way that could then allow for certain kind of redeployment of kind of the history of philosophy and theology, for example, and their use of nature. There's some parallels there, but there's if one insists that in the last instance it's underdetermined, and that in the last instance somehow it's actually not reducible only to this species, perhaps that gets us to the beginning of an answer. But anyway, it's something that we could discuss afterwards, and I'd be curious what everyone thinks. So let me return to the question of the victim, to the lived and man and person, and how to construct an ethics according to them. The victim is subtracted from the quid pro quo of the world in which violence breeds violence through kind of reciprocal retaliations and a kind of logic of vengeance, right? A kind of ceaseless and ceaselessly functional economy of violence, right? And the circular logic of violence for Laruelle is only naturalized by political philosophy, or say the juridical apparatus, and even he says by the work of memory, because for him all too often the kind of work of memory becomes itself a kind of weapon in the present to wield for yet another round. So as he writes, the paradox is that to exterminate so natural a vengeance, justice must no more be entrusted to the institution than to individual victims. So to whom? To victims taken as a generic body. But this is only the condition of justice, not its subject or object. From this comes the ethical precaution that extends the theoretical one. Justice is a utopia or a file of fiction, which has only as much of a future as man and person himself. So the question of ethics is a question of justice, and I do think that one should think this in relation to deconstruction, not simply as a justice to come, but as a kind of justice of the generic human that is already there, but undercomes as a kind of other future, right? But I do think that in some ways understanding why there's a kind of justice that's not reducible to institutional or kind of worldly logics, why that's an important part, I do think it's clearly connected to kind of Levinas and Derridian heritage there, mutatis mutandis. The question is removing the mechanism that establishes or reestablishes equilibrium and setting the whole mechanism in relation to something below it, right, or preceding it, this generic victim and person. Because desiring equilibrium, desiring kind of payback in some ways, even if it's the most honored kind, is what perpetuates vengeance, continues to produce ever more victims through settling scores, through acquiring new strengths based on old victims. So one of the reasons, this is another element that I'm not going to go into too far, but it's interesting. I think one of the reasons why he likes, or he kind of theorizes heresy and heretics so much, is that heretics for him are those figures that do not have a kind of anyone that's keeping up a tradition based on them in such a way that their memory could cause this kind of cycle to be reignited, right? There's a way where Gnostics and heretics are wiped out in such a way that they show that there are those kind of mediational apparatuses themselves are never as kind of, like, they're not the all and the absolute as they show, right? There's a way where the heretics are those who are not survived or remembered or honored, right? They don't get plaques, they don't get memorialized. They're the ones that they were exterminated because they were heretics. They kind of deserved it, right? And that kind of extra, that no one recuperates the heretics, for him is itself points to precisely kind of a generic humanity that doesn't, that in its kind of failure to be recuperated shows something other than the world and salvation, tradition, theodicy, and so on. Okay, so another kind of interesting thing, I mean, I think this is in some ways related to my comment on precarities. I think the question of torture can be fairly interestingly theorized on the basis of Laruelle's non-standard causality and logic. I think torture becomes, or could be seen not simply as a juridical or political mechanism of extraction or some kind of inducement of intimidation, but the very act that attempts to materialize in the body this hallucination of the world, of philosophy, which reads man as exhausted by and in the world. It is the production of the unity of man and person and the subject, right? The subject, in some ways, torture says something like, you are nothing but what powers makes of you. Theoretically, this entails the glorification of the subject in and of the world, as the exhaustion of man and person. There's nothing that you're not for power in the moment of torture, right? Because you're made kind of present fully. There's no kind of remainder, and that's, or at least, again, that's what it's repeatedly trying to accomplish. In some ways, it becomes a kind of material, attempting to make material reality this hallucination of the world in which the human is always exhausted by the world. So he said, a quote from Laruelle, not on torture, but I think on a very related topic. He says, "The world is criminal as force of force, reaffirming itself. It is a redoubled forcing that forces man to appear, to make himself visible in the form of the world. Man is entitled to secrecy, but the world is a forced parousia of man, who thus appears as victim." And I think you see this logic. What victimization is for him is this kind of forced inclusion in the kind of the totality, the unity of the world, right? And I think in some ways one can think of torture as the most extreme version of this, because it repeatedly tries to kind of, through this bodily, I will say through pain, forces one to be present fully in the world. And it is interesting. I don't know if Laruelle deals with the question of pain anywhere, but it would be interesting because I think for Laruelle, he thinks the world can never really succeed, right? He says man is not murderable, but the form world kills him by reformulating him as present in the world, implanting in it as a subject. There's a way where I think for Laruelle, the world can never succeed in doing what it wants to do to this kind of generic human. It can only convince itself that it does. But I do wonder what the kind of question of, say, of like production of like pain and torture, right? Does that materialize the kind of generic man into the subject in a way that can't be escaped, right? Anyway, this I'd be interested if. I'd be interested if anyone had thoughts on this, if this seems like a productive line of inquiry or line of thought. So I'm going to read one small quote, which I think kind of inaugurates the next section of this paper. So he writes, "The generic provides no purity. Purity is the dream of mixtures. But this intimate nudity can act and topple all transcendences, those of the earth and of the sky, into a more radical immanence." In this quote, we hear one key characteristic of Laruelle's conception of the victim, namely, that though separated from the world, an exaltation of agency and strength, the victim still possesses a weak force of its own. It can still put into radical question and debase the transcendences that give the illusions of strength and perpetuate the processes of victimization. Radical weakness, which is what he says the radical, not absolute weakness, is what Laruelle ascribes to the victim, still possesses, quote, a certain proper or lived force in person. This is the vectorial insurrection. Or again, slightly differently, the victim is the most exposed depth of humans. Their capacity to be defeated on occasions that also revive this capacity as a weak force of resistance. The victim thus denotes a passivity that cannot simply be caught up in the power play of the world, but one that still has the power of depotentializing, debasing, withdrawing philosophical power. Its weak force is a force outside of the relations of power, characteristic of an immanence of the in-person, which is not simply a failed strong force. We're not in the world kind of failing to do what the strong do, right? It's not the force of the world, and the point is not to inverse the values, right? It's to possess precisely as weakness a certain proper or lived force in person. This is what he calls the vectorial insurrection. And I think in some ways one way you could think about it is for him this kind of weakness that still has some kind of force, this lived force, is something that precedes the very differentiation between like the weak and the strong, as say someone like Nietzsche presents it. So it's not just like the same way between good and evil. It's not just choosing evil. It's somehow thinking of a kind of, what he calls unilateralizing that whole duality, and thinking kind of from a point that kind of exceeds and precedes it, right? So to understand how this works, it is necessary to see how exactly transcendence functions. In relation to the victims, it is linked with the dimension of persecution caused by certain hallucinatory inversion. The following is one formulation, I think, that gives a sense of how this works. Persecution comes from the confusion of the means or the productive forces humans have at their disposal, and the transcendent or worldly finalities according to which they organize those means. The same means that could help humans become ambiguous as soon as these finalities take charge of them, the humans. That which could struggle against persecutions put in its service, it is a hijacking of the generic by the philosophical capital that makes up the world. To assert the primacy of the generic is to affirm it as, in the last instance, cause of all those forces and means projected into the beyond, that in turn, when projected into the beyond, instrumentalize the human. And I think here is the kernel of the kind of a logic of philosophical anthropology of something like a Feuerbachian sort, even if the exact logic is changed because of the way he imagines. Like man is doesn't have any substance to him, right? He doesn't have an identity. It is something in the last instance that is foreclosed to the world and the worldly thought. And yet there's this sense where what transcendence and kind of does is misrecognize something that is the capacity of the human, and winds up making it work against the human, right? Of victimizing it or oppressing it in various forms. We hear this precisely because theological and philosophical transcendences need to be debased to affirm the immanence of mankind. Transcendence then is a kind of misrecognition, a sort of hijacking. The world and history are not the fulfillment, but the betrayal of the generic immanence of the victim. And so for example, the ethical call, where he calls to become resistance fighters, or to the stranger, which can, by its kind of strangeness, debase philosophy in its valorization of history, of the absolute of the world. So I think it's important to note that Laruelle's critical diagnosis of philosophy does not return him back to embracing the theological or transcendence in any form. Rather, his task is to diagnose the two discursive traditions and mutate them imminently in favor of the victim, or of their victims especially, and make them partake in the generic humanity for which they become merely historical materials or modes of kind of hermeneutics. And he talks about how basically what non-standard thought does, and what non-philosophy and future Christ try to do, is take kind of religious traditions or philosophical traditions and kind of invert them in such a way that they're no longer towering over the generic human, but somehow become modes of interpretation, right? Things that could be used in ways that are productively and liberating ultimately, and not something that yields a certain either conformism or a certain kind of teleological apparatus. So, in other words, for him, it's not a movement from ontotheology, say, to transcendence, right? But the collapse of both of them towards the generic immanence of man and person. And so the opposite of ontotheology, for example, is not a fideism or a relation to alterity or to some kind of new reformulation of God. Instead, I think, in some ways, the reason why I'm saying this is because I think that very much in the religious turn or in the theological turn, kind of thought the opposite of ontotheology is a certain affirmation of a kind of adieu, the kind of figures of transcendence that are ineffable but still transcendent, that recuperate precisely theological traditions of, say, negative theology, right, where the God is beyond being, beyond all kind of conceptual determination. And I think for Laruelle, we don't move from ontotheology to, or critical diagnosis of ontotheology to transcendence. Rather, that both of them are doing very kind of similar things, and we have to reaffirm this kind of the kind of radical immanence of the victim, which is foreign to both of those formulations. So he says, no, I'm not going to go for a quote, but so one could say that ontotheology for Laruelle denotes as much the thinking of metaphysics in terms of being and a kind of a ground in a supereminent being, as much as a logos. That is, at once, it's literally, I think the way he thinks of it is, it's a logos grounded in a being and grounded in a God, right? Ontotheology. And that ties philosophy and theology together. They're both kind of failing, and one has to kind of invert the both of the discourses. Indeed, I think we should take seriously such lines as, we must relocate the basis of thought from the so-called good God to the victims of his real maliciousness, right? Although, and of course, when you think about the God beyond being, like say in Marion's expression, is affiliated or associated with the good, right? It is the God as the good, and you could see this kind of inversion where that's not where Laruelle is going at all. Although at the same time, it's clear that for Laruelle, the theological material still remains central, but still as inverse towards the generic human. So for example, he says we need to order creation, which is supposedly good, but in fact a failure, according to the inmost misfortune that constitutes humans. So the return is not to theology, but to a radical, ungrounded non, that is generic. The non of non-standard or non-philosophical thought opposes the sufficiency and the grounding operations, the operations of justification. And when I say justification, I mean it both in some ways philosophically and theologically, right? Because philosophically it's kind of giving reasons and giving a full kind of explanation, but in theologically, justification is kind of questions of salvation, right? Of being saved. But in some ways you could say that in the no and the ungroundedness of the generic human kind of rejects both modalities, philosophical and theological, of justification. Because it declares the very imperative of justification itself a hallucination produced by philosophy and theology. For example, there's references, for example, a man and person being just without justification, which is to say it is already just. There's no process that we need to get to, right? There's no machine kind of something like a theological economy or moral economy in which one needs to be saved and then one's doing something, because this is very much the kind of logics of mixtures, of fusions, of kind of desired ends that Laruelle critiques in both philosophy and theology, right? There's no, we're no longer kind of searching for equilibriums of being saved. We're no longer searching for completion of history or seeking kind of pleromas or parousias. I would say, as a side note, in this, Laruelle does, to me, stand in tradition of kind of medieval mysticism that wants to articulate something like life without a why, right? Or here maybe a live without a why. It is a no that is addressed to any transcendence that would require operations of surpassing, synthesis, or unity to take place. There's no transcendence to be reached after the plan of salvation is abrogated, or simply made the status, or reduced to kind of the status of the property of man. And he wants to render, as he says, the plan of salvation definitively non-calculable for God himself. Right? So there's no ultimate legitimation of a kind of any plan of salvation or any path of justification. But this non is not just a hope for the destruction of the world, a rebellion against it, but is an imminent rebellion, one that is a lived imminence. It is as he says, it is an insurrection once each time of the imminent lived, traversing and debasing the most excessive monotheistic transcendences. And this is a bit of repetition, but I think it's worth insisting on that. Transcendence for essentially for Levinas, for Laruelle, does not just refer to God like it does in Levinas, or an ethical transcendence, but it precisely refers to something like the world and God both in opposition to the radical immanence of man, because man is, quote, withdrawn into himself, into his radical immanence, that is his non-consistency or his in-person insistence. And this is, he contrasts insistence with existence, and because existence is a kind of, for him, a kind of precisely following a Heideggerian logic of kind of being thrown into the world, but there's a kind of insistence that's not worldly. So fundamentally, man, as we've said before, man is not in the world, but persists as a kind of radical solitude, a radical foreclosure before the world. And in some ways, I have a question that if radical immanence is a modality of withdrawal of man in opposition to the world, right? There's a radical foreclosure or radical solitude, which he does thought. The question is whether we get caught up in some kind of quasi, almost Kierkegaardian position of the impossibility of a full visibility of the human, right? There's some kind of apophatic unreachability of the in-person. Does it recapitulate something of something like a radical interiority that the world cannot get at, right? Is it an assertion that there's something in me that power cannot touch? And I think that precisely the reason why I bring this up, I think the kind of insistence of the radical solitude, of the foreclosure of the world, and the kind of even the formulation in person feels like there is something with it, there is something like an apophatic something that cannot be reached, right? There's like, I'm a stranger to this world, and there's a spark of strangeness. And so I think there is something to such an interpretation in whatever modality wants to give it. I doubt anyone actually wants to call him a Kierkegaardian. But I think there's something else going on in Laruelle's conception of the in-person, and this comes out in some of his stranger and perhaps more mystical formulations. For example, and also, especially, his attribution of a glorious body to the victim. For example, we hear, if the subject, as stripped, lives on the earth in monuments, right, the victim in person, on the contrary, insists in the nowhere, in the not where, sukhravardi, and we will add in the not when. This nowhere and no time or no when is later characterized as the real virtual. And this lived immanence is still without logical identity, which I think in some fundamental way it is to say that it's not individuated, right? To say it without logical identity and to insist that there's a kind of nowhere, no when, or in one, as he says in prior iterations of his thought. I do think it suggests that it's that is not individuated, and so it can't be a radical interiority, because precisely it precedes individuation, because individuation is something bestowed upon the human as subject in the world. I would suggest that we think of individuation, therefore, as a kind of second order operation of subjects in the world, or at best, subject strangers, as Laruelle has it. But if the logic, and this slightly goes to an earlier point, if the logic of transcendence, which is to say of the history of the world, is brought down by the undercoming or coming under of a non-historical immanence that is real virtual, this glorious body cannot be a simple individual body, but one that is immanent through superposition and kind of addition. It is victorial in the sense that it can be multiple and immanent at the same time. And I think one could say that when I say undercoming, the French is sous-venir, and in some ways it's, I think, his retort to souvenir as memory, right? So it's like if souvenir as memory is a mediational kind of representative function, souvenir is an undercoming that undermines the sufficiency of the world, right? There's so immanence does not memorialize, but rather comes under and undermines the formations of unity, totality, and transcendence. Quote, the generic body gets that which is glorious and which distinguishes from the survivor, the hero, and the saint from its incorruptible and indestructible nature, from its lived without life, not static, but capable once each time of being reactivated or revived by perpetual insurrection. This is to say, that's the end of the quote. This is to say, I think that a perpetual insurrection of the glorious body is the generic immanence that precedes all individuation, which applies to subjects and worlds. And so part of what I'm trying to say is that in some ways, the foreignness of man and person to the world, or the fact that he or she or it is foreclosed to the world, perhaps still cannot be thought in an individuated way, and therefore I think we have to really think about what man and person actually denotes, right? Because there's a way where man and person, you want to have this kind of empirical image in which there is a kind of like an indexical to something individuated, because it's not humans. It's oftentimes man and person seems singular, but there's a way where on some other level it cannot be individuated in that way. So, in a kind of closing page or so, maybe a little less, I want to add something a little more about the tonality that this lived and the generic gives to Laruelle's conception of the victim. The victim is less a question of lamentation than of thinking a certain fundamental possibility of being affected, of being vulnerable, but also at once entailing a certain kind of capacity of resistance and a certain kind of glorious body. So, for example, you could listen to this, right? He says individual subjects, insofar as an individual subject, insofar as it is a subject through other bodies. So individual subject is a subject insofar as it is subject through other subjects, but it is more deeply interpolated as the glorious body. It takes it on, or as a materiality a priori able to suffer or to rejoice, to be an affected body. It is as much an attempt not to cover, so Laruelle's thought is as much an attempt not to cover over the reality of the victims in the processes of victimization, as it is to affirm the immanence of the victims and their capacity for insurrection, and he even says resurrection, right? Their glorious insistence that it is the basis of the possibility of a certain utopian filofiction. I think there is a strange optimism, I would even say, not for reforming the world, not for kind of reinventing stories of salvation, far from that, but an optimism for the possibility of insurrection and resurrection, understood in a particular way as an immanence that precedes and exceeds and remains unaffected by the world that seeks to persecute it. The difficulty in this concept as well is quite acknowledged by Laruelle himself. He says the stumbling block is obvious, the introduction of resurrection, and worse still of the risen, or the glorious lived in a non-Christian, or in a certain sense atheistic thought. So he knows this a kind of it's strange to call this atheistic, and there's a kind of conceptual scandal involved in there. But the task for him is thinking non-standardly, according to the logic of non-philosophy, and not thinking resurrection the way it's typically thought. So it's not a common sense, as he said, it's not a miracle oscillating between, say, being and nothingness, or it's not just simply, as he says, a survival across death, right? It's not, which is what he thinks. He doesn't go too deeply into this, but he basically thinks that Paul's interpretation of the Gospels is basically something like a historical scheme of making resurrection a historical event that follows the crucifixion in such a way that we're kind of reinscribing it as a kind of basically a historical event, even if it's the kind of something that breaks history. But ultimately, it's not. It's for him something that a survival of resurrection is too often thought of just as survival of death or overcoming of death. But in contrast to this, he wants to say to arise which is also to be resurrected, right, or ressuscité in French, is not to be reborn or to bring back to life, but to come under, to souvenir, as generic lived, to bring victims as the future in person, or the insurrection that is no longer immortality. Or perhaps, anyway, I'm not going to give you the next quote, but part, I think, what he wants to do is think about resurrection or insurrection or this kind of glorious body as something which, again, is characteristic of an immanence of the generic human that in some ways precedes all operations of mediation, right? And so he in some ways, one could say it's a question of how does one understand his claims that this only the subject dies, but the man and person never dies, right? Or the man and person is basically this kind of undying thing. And I don't know if, Michael, you have any questions or any thoughts on this, but I'd be curious. So I have one last thing I want to say, and this is a kind of a speculative addendum. I want to propose a parallel here, and this is really kind of in the beginnings of my thoughts, so I'm not sure that I might withdraw this in a couple weeks more of thinking. But I want to speculatively propose a parallel here on the affirmation of the generic rising up of the glorious body, and the discussions within kind of recent radical black studies, which I've been thinking about. Although on one side, there's a drive towards an insurrection against the world, one that seeks to destroy it. There's also in Laruelle a certain affirmation or celebration of the common or the generic insurrectional capacity. So the reason why I bring up black studies is because Anthony has and Dan Barber productively, well, I think Anthony especially have thought of Frank Wilderson's rejection of the world in his Afro-pessimism in relation to Laruelle's logics of kind of the kind of ultimate destruction of the world and the way the world kind of produces victims, death, and kind of exclusion. But I wonder whether precisely this destructive urge, or in some ways as part of it, there's also a kind of celebratory urge, and this celebratory urge is in some ways found in the kind of opposite side of this discussion that's happening in radical black studies. On one side by Frank Wilderson, on the other side, and Jared Sexton, who have this kind of articulated what they consider as a kind of Afro-pessimism or black pessimism. On the other side, there's Fred Moten, who agrees that there is a kind of unrecuperable violence done to the figure of the slave, to blackness, but he also does not want to give up on a certain kind of insurrectional or kind of celebratory kind of optimistic excess. In other words, whether the generic immanence of Laruelle is, my question is, whether the generic immanence of Laruelle is an attempt to both reject the world, its sufficiency, vengeance, its self-possessed subjectivity, is at once also rebellion, and one that's precisely a rebellion through an affirmation of an immanence of what is below, what is precedes and exceeds it in a kind of way that is unaffected by it. In one way of putting it would be that man and person doesn't appear, but it doesn't appear as an immanent lived, as a glorious and insurrectional body that rebels against the order of the world, against the world as such. And I think there's basically something, there's clearly something deeply affirmative or at least glorious in this insurrectional body as Laruelle describes it. But it is also precisely not individualized, as I mentioned, or at least I want to think of it not as individuated or individualized, but the glory of a generic immanence, right, of the possibility of what actually Moten calls the undercommons. And it's kind of interesting, given that we've talked about souvenir as coming under or undercoming, how close that actually comes to Moten's undercommons, which is a theorization of this kind of like form of insurrectional sociability that is kind of excluded by the world, by the socio-political, but still there's a certain form of social life that is possible by it. And for example, Jared Sexton actually in trying to mediate the two positions or try to like make them not conflicting talked about this is the social life of social death. So anyway, I wonder whether or not basically there's a certain optimism or a certain insurrectional or depersonalized joy of a life or a lived that is no longer possessed by oneself, right, by one subject or another. and that this joy is something that the world can never offer, but one that persists outside of it, below it, preceding and exceeding it, but most importantly should never be recognized as something beyond the world, but precisely as something that is possible at its margins and its exclusions. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Alex.